You know, there's something really interesting about how both Overlord and Isekai Mao have this setup where the main character is partially incapable of expressing their true feelings to some extent. You know, for Overlord, you've got Ainz Al-Gun, who is not only regulated by the spell, but he's also forced to play this far-thinking entity who has to fulfill the Guardian's image of him as the leader of the Supreme Beings. In short, he has difficulty communicating. And the same is for Isekai Mao. Diablo has somewhat similar challenges. Like Ainz, he plays this persona of a powerful being who encases all of his actions in a theatricality that matches his raw magical power. And they definitely hit hard. Both of them are incredibly powerful. So it's kind of curious, right, that there's a tendency for powerful protagonists to have some limitation on their ability to communicate, and therefore they fall back on their power as a way to start establishing social relations with others.
That's exactly what you need to talk about. In Isekai Mao, you have characters who have really difficult to communicate with each other, and that's the whole plot of comedy issues of the series. Overlord is not exactly the same thing because he play a role, but it's not exactly the same thing like in Isekai Mao, who he play RP, you know, he play roleplay, he role-playing because he can't communicate with the others, but in Overlord it's not the same way. He don't have a problem to communicate, he have a problem to express his true feelings and his true meanings. When Demiurgos decide in Overlord when Ainz Al-Gun's main purpose is to invade the world, and it's absolutely not his purpose.
面白いかもしれないな。まあ、そんなことできるわけないけど。
But the others thinks that, and that's the problem in this communication of the characters.
I just realized that before we go further, I should probably get you to introduce yourself.
I need to introduce myself. I'm just a French nit who likes Isekai.
だ、そう、自然に聞けば。その程度の力量で俺に勝とうとは。ルールも目的も不明だか。
トウヤ、望月トウヤです。
あの時か。即応大隊を率いるなど。
I read Isekai, I like Isekai, and I wrote about Isekai, and I think it's a really interesting subject. Even if a lot of people think it's stupid and still all the same things, it expresses a lot of things about society in the 21st centuries.
Alright, so let's get this started. How would you define Isekai? Like, what is it?
Oh, wow, how do you define Isekai? Isekai is not like Sword Art Online, you know? Sword Art Online is not Isekai because it's not physically in another world, but it's not the same purpose and not the same subject. Like Sword Art Online is more like, oh, it's a guy who plays World of Warcraft and I tell you his story. But an Isekai is more like a guy or girl who's transported in another world, shokan or not. You know, it's more like narrow or not narrow, because you have some series who are not narrow before the Isekai boom, like the 12th Kingdom, and 12th Kingdom is like an excellent Isekai. You know, when you define Isekai, is like a main character travel in another world by what about the points, like a magic portal, an invocation, a divine being, but the important point is you need to incarnate physically in this world, even if it's a video game world. Like in Overlord, Isekai Mao, you know, it's like it's video game, but it's not really the game world. It's not a VR MMO. It's a true world. It's resemble the game, but it's not the game. That's what the main character said in Isekai Mao. It's say, oh, it's like that, but in another chapter is like, oh, that's not like this when I played. So that's the things who difference Isekai and VR MMO, like Sword Art Online.
Okay, so we're defining it as not Sword Art Online. So why do you think people associate it with SAO?
Sword Art Online appeared at the right time, just before Isekai, and just after the survival game anime like Mirai Nikki, B2 and stuff like this. So it's like the perfect transition between these two genres. So I think that's why a lot of people associate it, because it's a fantasy world, it's a survival game, but in the story, you know it's trapped by his mind, but when you read it or when you watch the anime, see body and the character who act like this, but he don't feel pain when he's hit, and I think it's an important thing of the Isekai. You need to feel pain.
これがダメージを負う感覚、痛みか。
You need to feel it incarnate. It's like the main character don't need to think I'm in the game, but I'm in another world. I'm not in the game. And when Sword Art Online appears, the main character play in a game, is trapped in, but he came out. He came out after 12 episodes in the anime. So it's not really an isekai, but well, he play game and you follow his adventure in the game, so you can feel it like an isekai because it's a virtual world, but it's not.
Okay, so you got an interesting word here, narou. We're starting to see quite a few narou-kei adaptations recently. Isekai Smartphone and Death March, for instance, are two notable examples. So the first question is, what is narou-kei, and why do you think it's becoming such a popular kind of isekai right now to adapt?
Narou-kei is like a type of writing of web novel on a Japan website of Let's Become a Novelist, and that's the name of narou-kei. And the story of narou-kei is typically a guy who's transported in another world, and he has an over-cheated who can destroy all of these obstacles like Sky Mao, Overlord. Sky Mao is absolutely a narou-kei because the character is an overpowered guy who can beat anyone, and is in another world, transport. It's a reincarnation, right? It's like a more a tensei. The character is dead. That's the type of isekai. Just the core of narou-kei is like an isekai where the main character is overpowered and he can't have a really difficulty in the world.
So you use the terms shokan and tensei. What do those mean?
Shokan is more like a character is invoked in another world, like in Isekai Mao, where the character is invoked like a demon lord. And Tensei is stories where the character is dead and reincarnated by God or something else, like Tensei Shitara Slime no Taken.
勘弁してほしい。
That's all. Just an Isekai gender.
From the isekai that you've read so far, is there a connective theme that ties them together?
Well, I think that the subject who is absolutely not used in isekai is science fiction. You always see fantasy, but you don't see science fiction. And robot, except in Night and Magic. That's the only one since 2010. Because, you know, the first isekai of the animation was robot, like done by Majin Wataru, Orgus, Magic Knight Rares. But you don't see them right now, because fantasy is the story who the Japanese are the most accustomed, because Sword Art Online was fantasy-like. If fantasy is working, why making something else? So you have the same path. You have a main character, male, with dark hair and sad story, and he evolved in a fantasy world like Dragon Quest. He's going to a guild, make adventure and stuff. When you read isekai manga, the main story is still unexplored. You don't know where this is going. It's not achieved. You don't see the end. You don't see where this is going and what the author want to tell you.
It's interesting that you mentioned that isekai don't tend to gravitate towards science fiction, because it kind of reminds me of that one isekai, the death mage who doesn't want to be reincarnated for a fourth time. It's a tensei story where the protagonist does reincarnate into a science fiction setting for his first loop, but then he's tortured and killed by his fellow reincarnators, and he's reincarnated the third time into a fantasy setting. It seems to me, in something like Knights and Magic or Death Mage, There is a sort of science fiction in terms of technological exploration, but it's hidden underneath the sort of simulacrum of fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see some isekai with a little of science, of technology. You don't see technology in isekai, except in some of them like Gunota. Gunota is shitty, but you see gun in this story. Gun in fantasy world. And modern gun. Even in Narou-kei FPS is more a fantasy world, but with modern technology. But only the main character is able to use it. So it's creates something like a little difference, a little originality. But it's still fantasy. You still see goblins, orc, and stuff.
That's actually really interesting because in terms of technology, you touch upon what seems to me to be very poorly hidden power dynamics, in that technology is how the protagonist gets the leg up on the fantasy world they're sent to. For example, you've got Narou-kei and Gunota, which have very clear technological advantages. The main character in Gunota, for example, is able to out-innovate the world simply because he's a gun otaku, and his encyclopedic knowledge of guns therefore immediately translates into production. For Narou-kei, right, even though he's considered to be low because of his lack of orthodox magical affinity, the protagonist's ability to use modern military equipment is a shock to the natives of the world regardless. And it doesn't even stop there. You've also got this fixation with interfacial technology. Even in settings where players don't use their technological prowess from our world, there remains a leg up in the context of mini-maps and statuses, because with some isekai, it allows protagonists to modify their skills, or they have situational advantages because of them. So you've got this other world, but this other world is like a game world, or it's got game features. But it's an asymmetrical system where the game features favor the protagonist, and it thus gives them a leg up.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, this story with the main character who's able to buy things via Amazon, Japan, and it's more like Yashike vibe. But it's absolutely something weird because it's a fantasy world, but you have more an omniscient vision of this world. Like a minimap is more a god eye, it's like a main character who's human but invested by power of god.
Yeah, they have a really complex logistical imagination, right? That it's not just one tech, but overall logistics of tech.
Particularly in Death March, where the main character started the game and destroyed an entire plane with a meteor strike.
Yeah, and I think it's that strike that puts all of the actions into motion. It gives him this power, and by being powerful and assured, he leverages that to just kind of go around and do tasks that are beneath his capabilities. There's also something really transgressive about it. Because if you look at Naruto or Bleach, the characters struggle and grow and they punch up. But for Isekai, specifically narou-kei, they tend to go the opposite direction. It's not about becoming strong. You're already strong. It seems to counter a lot of traditional orthodox shonen jump narratives of tatakai, to not only say that such a linear progression isn't what these authors care about, that they aren't focused on becoming strong and recognized, they're already like that. But they tend to do other things with that power, and it's oftentimes to make up for immaterial social shortcomings or preferences that they had in their previous lives. This all kind of reminds me of Fuyahara Patora, the author of Isekai Smartphone, and his comment on Twitter where he says that Isekai Smartphone isn't a story about being unparalleled in another world. It's a story about connections made by using a smartphone. If it were about power, if it were about that particular power, that control, it'd be called Shape a Different World with a Smartphone. So the intentions, it seems to be lying elsewhere for a lot of these sorts of stories. The strength or capability, in other words, is a means to an end. So with this discussion in mind, where do you think Isekai like Overlord Ragnarok and Isekai Mao stand in its broader ecology?
Overlord and Isekai Mao are not so different, because you have an overpowered character with an inability to communicate with people with overpowered power. But in this world, they are more like referred not human, like not divine being. Well, for Isengol is like a god and is, Demiurgos, Albedo and stuff. These people adore him like a god. He created them, so with his friend, but it's more like that. It's not absolutely the same things like in Isekai Mao, because in Isekai Mao you have a cheated characters, absolutely, but the character is more human. Even if he has power more than other guy, but he is still, you can talk with him. It's not a god. You don't talk with him with fear. It's maybe his role-playing, his character, le décalage, you know, powerful and stuff, but inside it's just absolutely afraid to talk with people. It's not absolutely the case in Overlord.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the next topic, because I think it's important that communication isn't the only idea that isekai have, because there's a huge variety of them. So let's talk about isekai that do communicate, but what they communicate is power.
Next time, we're going to talk about how food and resources are intricately intertwined with isekai, and how material and immaterial factors play an important role in understanding both space and identity.